Okay, fake news. It's been around for a while, hasn't it? Who of you, and just raise your hands please, who of you is aware that you actually have disseminated fake news through your Facebook account, Twitter account, or whatever kind of account? Who of you has done that or has found out? It's less hands than I would think, because I think many more people actually have disseminated fake news, probably without knowing, only knowing afterwards, right? I have. I've only found out afterwards that, you know, this message that I got through my bubble in Facebook was actually fake. So it's all around, and I think we're all being confronted with it, many times not knowing it. And that's probably going to change over time, hopefully. But right now, that is a problem. So I'm working, just shortly, I'm working for this company called Hill & Knowlton, which is an agency, and we advise companies, mostly companies, on how to interact with the public and how to engage with the public. And of course, the public and the society is also engaging with these organizations. So they are prone to be influenced through fake news, and therefore we think about what to do about that. How can they actually work with, you know, the phenomenon of fake news, and how can they react to it, and how can they try to manage that? So that's where this is coming from. Just to have a look at fake news. It's as I said, it's all around. The Las Vegas shooting in October was also, in the end, prone to fake news, because what happened is that this Trump supporter, right after the shooting, thought about how can I actually link this shooting to liberals, to the Democrats, simply because I want to, simply because I think that the liberals should be bleeding for this. And so he did. It was a false story fabricated by this far-right person who spent his night thinking about this. And actually it came up in Google's top stories, and it was a Facebook trending story. So again, it's everywhere, it's all around. Where's it coming from? And indeed there is a slight delay here. So where's it coming from? It's, as we said, it's been all around. Actually, I've been working with media, traditional media, for over 20 years. First as a journalist myself, and then as a communications advisor. And my personal experience is that over those 20 years, fake news through traditional media has grown dramatically. And that's simply because there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of pressure on these traditional media. Their editorial staffs have been shrunk to very small sizes, and they have to produce more news with less people in a competitive environment, and therefore you see that, let's say, the balance in news, all sides, you know, to take in all sides and all views before publishing. That's, in many cases, that's gone. There's simply no time for that anymore. So in traditional media, we're seeing this. But the phenomenon of what we're talking about today, obviously, has been really fueled by social media. And the Facebooks and the Googles of this world don't like to hear it. But it's them who actually facilitated this phenomenon. And so you see through this graph here, how social media are increasingly a source of primary news for people. And if you're active on Facebook, mostly, or on Instagram, Twitter, you will probably notice that much of the news you're getting through these channels. And there are many organizations out there, whether they are in Russia or elsewhere, who actually know this, of course. And they know how to reach you, and they know how to target you by creating news stories that appear to be real news stories, but that are actually not. And they know that actually in some countries, for example Spain, more than 50% of the people are actually taking in their primary news from through social media. So social media is actually, I mean, fake news has started more in the political arena, or at least that's where it sort of got noticed, and that's where it started to play a real role. And of course the elections in the US, but also the elections in France, and probably the elections in Germany have been influenced through this phenomenon of fake news. Certainly in the US, and these days, of course, we're getting so much more information, so much more evidence that this has actually happened on purpose. There was a scheme behind it. So we're seeing that. But it's also moving into corporate life, into my client's life. So there was this boycott towards Pepsi from Trump supporters because they actually got the news through their channels that the CEO said that that Pepsi doesn't want the business of Trump voters. The CEO has never said that. It was completely misrepresented and misinterpreted. But there was someone with an interest to spread this story. It went viral, and Pepsi actually got a real hit from that. Just to look at the stock price, it fell. It fell because of this fake news story spreading. It fell on the day that it started, but it fell further down throughout the month. And it fell even harder than after Pepsi had published a profit warning. So that's the impact that we're talking about for companies these days. It's not anymore something that's out there and that's a nuisance. It actually costs a lot of money and confidence and trust in these companies. There's also a company out there that already has a trust issue. That's called Monsanto. That's also being targeted, of course. And it's always difficult to say by whom, but they are being targeted. In this case, Monsanto was accused of using this chemical compound that would that created this microcephaly spread throughout certain countries in Africa. Actually, that wasn't true. It wasn't because Monsanto was not involved at all. So it wasn't their product. It wasn't due to a product anyway. It was due to the Zika virus that was spread through the mosquitoes. But it was pinpointed to Monsanto. And when did this go viral? This went viral when a famous actor with 10 million followers picked up on the story and published it. And that's when it started spreading. And that's when, in the end, there was this big accusation towards this company. So what did they do? And it's very difficult for organizations to react to this. So what did they do? Actually, Monsanto has a millennial engagement officer. I've never heard of that term, but there is a millennial engagement officer at Monsanto who actually engages with many of you, because I see quite a few millennials, I think, in this room, right? Don't know if they already reached you, but they have this guy who's really with a team who's after you. So what he did is he actually used his employees, his co-workers. So instead of actually coming up with official statements, etc., he engaged his own employees and asked them to counter stories that they would see in their bubbles, in their social media environments, and really engage and advocate for the company. There's an example here on the right that I think goes a bit far as to the language that's being used, but it's an interesting phenomenon on how this company is actually not reacting in a very corporate way, but trying to react in a much more human way by actually using humans. So there are many ways in which organizations and companies are actually thinking about how should we deal with this? How can we react to this? And many big corporations are a bit like the EU. They're big institutions. They're almost like ministries and also as slow as ministries. But they have to react very fast. So it's very difficult for big organizations, whether they are of governmental nature or whether they are of corporate commercial nature, it's very difficult for them to react very quickly. And you have to be fast, because it's, you know, when you were in a crisis 20 years ago, it was the first 24 hours that marked the outcome of the crisis. So whatever you did in those first 24 hours determined the outcome of the crisis. Today, it's the very first 4 minutes. It's not even 24 minutes anymore. It's 4 minutes. So you have to be on the game and on the ball all the time. And that's very difficult if you are in an organization that actually wants to first have a statement being checked by about 10 people and being signed off in the end by the CEO or whatever. It takes too long. In this day and age of this kind of news spreading so quickly, you don't have that time anymore. And you really have to think about beforehand, what are we going to do and how are we going to do this? So just to conclude, I have summed up 6 truths of dealing with fake news. There are many more out there, and they may not be the real truths, but at least these are tactics that we've tried and tested that we know can work in order to deal with fake news if you're looking at this subject from a viewpoint of working in an organization, being attacked as an organization, and dealing with it. So, what are those truths that you need to take into consideration? First of all, we're all journalists. We can all publish today. And we don't have the ethical standards that Tom was talking about, right? We're not being trained in journalistic ethical standards. We just publish. So what you need to do as an organization is that you actually listen. You go out there, you listen, you monitor, and you map influences. You need to know who's talking about you, when, where, and who are they influencing. Secondly, because it's about individuals, we're talking about audiences that are really scattered. So people who are listening to you, people who are listening to those spreading fake news, they're all over the place. So you need to use data to know your audience. You know who's listening. You need to know who's listening to what, when, where. And you can use data to understand your audiences much better. Data, having this data, is really having the power. And actually the Russians have understood this. The Russians are absolute masters of mapping audiences and using data to know who they should target, when and where. So knowing your audience by using data is key. And then once you do know these audiences, make sure that you use target messaging to reach them. I grew up and I was trained when I went to journalism school with the idea of the big hypodermic needle of information that's being inserted into people. We're now living in a day and age where people are actually in small microcosmoses with their own very specific interests. And you actually, and they look for that kind of information. And they're very much open to the kind of information they are interested in, and the rest is gone. So what we're talking about is micro-targeting. And micro-targeting is really one of the most influential and most powerful ways to actually make sure that you reach audiences with your messages. Number 4 is about emotions. Because the natural reaction that many people would have is, once you see fake news appearing, is to counter it with facts. But in many cases, fake news that's really being fabricated is appealing to emotions. It's not about facts, it's appealing to emotions. And so you need to counter these emotions. And you don't do that through facts. Ask Shell and Brent Spa. The mother of all crises of the modern time is that one where actually Shell tried to counter the emotions around the sinking of the Brent Spa with facts. They failed because they didn't insert emotions. So you need to convey facts, but you need to include them in an emotive way of communication. And you need to use your creativeness. That means you need to think about audio-visual communications much more than only text and words in order to convey your message. Number 5, it's all about, as I said, it's all about timing. It's all about being quick. Be ready to respond immediately. So you need to know what's going on. You need to have your monitoring out there. You need to have your teams out there that actually know what's going on. They need to be able to alert you very quickly. And you need to be able to decide very quickly how to counter the news that is spreading. So be ready to respond, and be ready to respond very decisively and very strongly. The mistake that many companies and many organizations make these days, still today, is that they are too modest almost in the way they want to. They're being very corporate. You know, we don't want to be too strongly worded, because maybe people will attack us over it. But if you're too modest in that way, you're not going to win this. You need to be strong and clear and concise in the way you respond. And secondly, not unimportantly, find others who actually endorse that message. You saying it is one thing, but Monsanto saying it is not enough. They're not trustworthy. So the Monsantos of this world, the PepsiCos of this world, and others, and even governments, need to find trustworthy others, third parties, endorsers, to actually help them disseminate that message. The sixth one is maybe the most important one in terms of managing fake news spreading, especially if it is very difficult to counter the messages, because they are so strongly worded, they are so credible for many audiences. And that is that you identify the source. And I think if Facebook and Twitter had made much more effort of identifying sources of news that was being spread during and before the American elections, possibly the impact would have been a lot smaller. But you need to know who the source is, where is it coming from, and you need to make your public aware who the source is of information. Many people don't look at who's disseminating this news, who's spreading this, where is this coming from. Many people read it, like it, and share it. They don't look at the source. So you as an organization have the obligation to really quickly analyze this, and then let your audiences know who is coming with this news. And actually the Macron campaign team used this tactic mostly in order to counter fake news. The one thing they did was looking at the source and creating stories around the sources if those sources were fake, not credible, malicious, or whatever. So 10 minutes to talk about a topic that we can, I think, discuss for hours, but hopefully it gave you a little bit of an impression of, what's out there, how is it spreading, and what can you do about it to manage it. And again, what I talk to you about in these 10 minutes is not the truth. There are 6 and there are many more out there, but at least it's an attempt to try and start managing this phenomenon, because it's something that I can assure you, you will know that the EU is struggling with it. I can assure you many companies are struggling with it. We're all still sort of pioneering here, and we're all still trying to find the answers to this problem. But it's a real problem and we need to manage it. Thank you very much.